Hello, this is the recording for Lecture 8 for the Gender and Sexuality module, and this time we're going to have a look at sex work. We'll touch on various forms of prostitution and ideas around prostitution, a little bit on pornography, and there'll be more on pornography in next week's class. As of last night, as I'm sure you're aware, the Prime Minister said we have to be on a 3-week lockdown, so we obviously won't be going back to college until at least after the Easter holidays at this rate. Hopefully by then they'll have found a treatment for coronavirus and things will be back to normal, fingers crossed. In the meantime, you need to hand in your report by this Friday. I know there's still these endless ongoing problems with access to the module page, so if by Friday Ipswich have got their finger out and sorted the module page, brilliant, you can upload there. If they haven't, then you can either email me your work, or I'll create a upload point on the new website I've set up. I think most of you have had a look at it by now. The URL is there for you, where you can find not only the podcasts but the previous PowerPoints and any other resources I can think of that are worth uploading there. I'll keep that site in existence until Ipswich have finally given you access to those same resources that are currently on Brightspace. I think at the moment the only person who can access any of it is Carl. But there we go. Anyway, so if you need any input advice around the interview before you upload it, then obviously email or Facebook or what have you to contact me by some form of social media, and I'll give you some advice and guidance before you upload or put it on the website, do whatever you're doing with it. Now, at base, prostitution, I'm sure it's fairly obvious to say, is the exchange of sexual services for money. It can also be other forms of material gain. So, for example, somebody could say to their landlord, I'll have sex with you if you'll give me a week of not having to pay the rent. And so they don't get given cold hard cash, but they do get a material gain in that they get a week or a month, however long it might be, without having to pay a particular bill, because the sex becomes the payment for the bill. Or you could be exchanging, a person could be exchanging sex for food, they could be exchanging sex for protection, safety. It's not an uncommon thing in some of the more violent prisons around the world for a sort of bigger, burlier, more aggressive prisoner to make an offer with a smaller prisoner that in exchange for regular sexual services the more aggressive prisoner will protect them from getting 7 shades kicked out of them by other prison gangs. And so those forms of prostitution also take place. There are some slightly cynical views of prostitution with its respect to alleged similarity to marriage, but we'll touch on those briefly as we go along. Now, for any kind of sociological overview of prostitution, we're hampered by the fact that reliable statistics simply don't exist. Quite how many women or men or children or transgendered people around the world sell sex for money or other material gain, it's impossible to say, because by and large most countries don't register people engaged in the sex trade, and sometimes it may be a one-off. That one single occasion they did it. For other people it may be something they're doing every single day for year upon year upon year. And so it's quite difficult to access how we understand the pattern, the nature, the extent of prostitution. The assumption is made that the vast majority of prostitutes are women selling their services to male customers, but we do know that obviously there are men who sell sexual services to women, gigolos, and men who sell sexual services to other men. There are children who sell sexual services to depraved adults. There are also women who sell sexual services to other women. So there's all sorts of combinations in all sorts of different directions. we assume, let's say, the majority are women selling to men, but we don't know what the exact percentages and fractions are. There could be a lot more men involved in sex work than anybody thinks. The percentage of same-sex prostitution versus heterosexual prostitution may be bigger or smaller than we imagine. So it's very difficult to say. So a lot of this is guesswork, really. To give examples of what we might call grey areas, would you class these things as prostitution, sex work, or something else entirely? Obviously, this is the juncture in a normal lecture where we'd all sit and have a lot of discussion and you'd all chuck ideas around with each other and with me. Unfortunately, we can't do that quite the same way, but if you want to, via perhaps Facebook, we could create a group chat or something in that vein. We could discuss that way if you want to share and bounce ideas around with each other or with me or both. So let's imagine a situation in which an actor, bearing in mind that that word these days includes men and women, this sort of Harvey Weinstein situation, effectively. An actor agrees to sleep with the director in exchange for which the director will give them a role in their film or stage play or TV show, whatever it happens to be. So they're not being given money per se, but they are gaining a career advantage which they perhaps would not gain if they refused to have sex with the director. And here, of course, we're assuming it's the Harvey Weinstein situation where the director is the one coming on to the actor and saying, "Oi, I'll only give you this part if you do X, Y, Z for me." It may be that there are situations around the world where it's the actor making the suggestion to a director who hadn't otherwise mentioned it. And then it's the director having to make the decision whether to go along with this offer or not. So is that a form of sex work? I'll have sex with someone if they give me a job, that kind of thing. Is it or is it not? Room for discussion there. The landlord situation we've already mentioned, but again, if rather than the landlord giving the tenant money, it's the landlord effectively writing off a debt and saying, well, instead of paying me X amount of money this week, this month, whatever period of time it might be, I'll take sexual favours in exchange, or possibly the cash-strapped tenant saying to the landlord when they come around to collect, "Look, I've got no money this week, what about if I offer you sex instead?" So who is initiating and who is on the decision-making end of this process might vary. Would it make any difference as to who initiates and who decides as to whether or not it counts as prostitution or some form of sex work? Questions to mull over and consider. Now, to explain what a cam boy is, there are cam boys and cam girls, and I'm assuming you're all far too sweet and innocent and lovely to actually know what cam boys and cam girls are. These are, well, cam boys, obviously a man, and a cam girl is a woman, who set up a video camera. Usually, I would guess, in their own home, but I suppose they could be setting it up practically anywhere, really. And they create a website, a channel, which could be on the dark web, or it could be on mainstream internet services, where it's illegal, I believe, but that doesn't stop people doing it. And other people, customers, have to log on to this website, and the usual thing is that they have to pay to gain access to the website once they've found where the website is. So they pay, I don't know, let's say 50 quid a week or something or another, and they gain access to this special section of the website, which is a live feed. So on the live feed there is the cam boy sitting at one end of the camera, and any number of people watching from presumably the privacy of their own sofas on the other end of the camera. And the cam boy can either just, some of them just do strip teases, some of them will, as per the example here, engage in sex acts like masturbating by themselves. Others will have a friend with them, another cam boy or a cam girl, and they'll perform sexual acts with each other. And quite often the customers sitting at the other end will type in messages saying, "Oh, do this, do that, do the other. So let's go for something twee and safe, and say somebody says, types a message saying, "Oh, take your socks off." So the cam boy or cam girl takes their socks off. So there is a degree of direction going on as to what is being seen and witnessed. And then when it's all over and done with, the cam boy just turns the camera off and that's your luck. So the paying customer has some element of control over what goes on, in as much as they can make suggestions or requests. Obviously, the cam boy or cam girl has free will not to follow out particular requests if they don't like the sound of it, but other requests, if they do think, yeah, fair enough, I'll do that, they can do so. And as I understand it, there are kind of sliding pay scales that the more money you pay, the more things you're allowed to demand, that sort of thing. It can include non-sexual acts. So to give you a bizarre example, some of you, I dare say, will be familiar with Judge Rinder, who does a sort of a British version of Judge Judy, where he sits in a courtroom, pretend courtroom, and passes decisions about people's petty disputes with one another. In one particular petty dispute, which is actually uploaded onto YouTube, so you could try and Google this clip, he's talking to some rather weird young man who's in a financial dispute with his own father. But one particular bit in the juncture of this program, they're talking about the young man's finances. And he says to Judge Rinder that he's a cam boy, and gets back the typical kind of daytime TV response of, "What on earth is a cam boy?" Yeah. And he goes on to explain pretty much what I've said to you. But he also points out, which I found quite bizarre and interesting, he gives examples of what customers request of him and how much they pay. And whilst some of it is sexual, he also says he's got one viewer who pays him quite large sums of money to clean his teeth in front of a camera. And that's it. There's no sex, there's no nudity, he doesn't get his nether regions out, he just films himself cleaning his teeth, and this guy at the other end of the camera is paying ludicrous sums of money to watch this young man clean his teeth. What the appeal of that is, I cannot begin to imagine, but it flags up a question which we'll get onto a bit later, that not all forms of prostitution are necessarily what you might imagine them to be. They can include acts which are not really sexual, but presumably have some kind of sexual satisfaction for the individual paying for them, even if they keep their clothes on and they're not engaged in the regular forms of sexual activity. So there's two questions there, I suppose. One, if the cam boy is masturbating whilst someone is paying to watch, that someone could be in a different town, they could be in a different country. They could be thousands of miles away and paying to watch this. So there is no physical contact between the customer and the lad in front of the camera. Is it, therefore, sex work? Now, obviously, masturbation is a sexual act, but is it sex work? What if, as per this chap on the Judge Rinder programme, he's being paid 50 quid to clean his teeth or do his ironing or do some weird thing, the person on the customer, for weird, deeply Freudian reasons, really enjoys watching, but it is in no shape, form or measure what most people would class as a sexual act. So the sexual thrill is entirely on the part of the customer. There is no sexual activity on the part of the cam boy or cam girl. Is that still therefore sex work or prostitution, or does it drift into some other type of category? Something to mull over. So, sticking with this idea that not all sex work is necessarily involving sex, and therefore begs the question, is it even sex work in the first place? It can include a whole raft of non-sexual activities. Now, some of them are fairly commonplace and well known. You've got the example there of sadomasochism. There was a quite famous case, well, several quite famous cases in Britain going back a few decades now, before some of you were even probably alive, I dare say, of women like Cynthia Payne, and a lady who called herself Miss Whiplash. I can't remember what her actual name was, but that's the name she used in the newspapers, in the sort of scandal rags that got very excited because some of her customers were celebrities and MPs and things like that. So the usual thing that somebody would go along to one of these ladies like Cynthia Payne and pay quite large sums of money to be slapped about or spanked or hit on the head with a rolled up newspaper or what on earth it was that they wanted. No sex as such, just the infliction of pain which they found sexually titillating. And that kind of begs this question, is it still sex work if there's no actual sex? If the customer gets their jollies by doing something other than conventional sex? Should it be classed in law as sex work, as prostitution, or should it be classed as something else entirely? Now, we have the oddity in British law that you cannot consent to be hit. So if stereotypically some MP, it could be anyone of course, somebody pays a prostitute to tie them up and whip them, so there's no sex, it's just tying up and whipping. No matter how much they enjoy it and pay for the money and go there out of their way seeking to have this done to them, in law they cannot consent to be whipped. Therefore, technically, that prostitute has engaged in an act of bodily harm and an act of assault, depending on quite how violent the whipping is. Whether it's actual bodily harm or grievous bodily harm is a moot point, but it is a criminal assault, which is very odd, because clearly the customer wants it so much they've gone out their way to get it and pay for it and so forth. And presumably the prostitute might be bored to death, they might not take any pleasure in the activity at all. They might be sitting there thinking about what they saw in EastEnders last night whilst engaging in this activity. Much the same way many people in jobs they find boring are going through the motions while their mind is off thinking about something else entirely. But technically it's a crime. Not a crime of prostitution, but a crime of assault, which is odd in itself. Now, the previous slide has mentioned feeders. I've stolen these photographs shamelessly off the net. Now, the couple at the top are a couple. That's not a prostitute and a customer. They are, or at least they were at the time the photograph was taken, a couple. If you're unfamiliar with this sort of scenario, it's called feeding, in which the man in the green t-shirt takes pleasure, sexual satisfaction, all sorts of other things that would keep Freud in business for a lifetime, by overfeeding the woman on the sofa. And as you can see, he's actually shoving I don't know what that is, a chip or something, into her mouth. He is feeding her in the very literal sense of not just watching her eat, but actually picking the food up and shoving it in her face. And she is consenting to this. The satisfaction of the feeder comes in making their partner as obese as they can get them. So it's not just feeding someone celery. The pleasure is in feeding them fatty, sugary foods that will make them very, very large as the lady on the sofa is. So this is, so far as I know, a consenting relationship between the two in the photograph. However, there are sex workers who are of similar dimensions to the lady on the sofa, who, and this is an ironic, weird sort of a situation if you think about it in any depth, they charge customers money to come round and feed them. And therefore not only are they getting fed for free, they are making the customer pay for the pleasure of watching them eat cake. Which, well, depending on how long this quarantine goes on for, we might have to start thinking about charging people money to watch them eat cake, but anyway. What the sexual satisfaction of that is, I can't begin to imagine. But is it a form of sex work? Let's pretend the lady is charging money. Would that be a form of sex work? I'm going to eat cake and you've got to pay 20 quid to watch me do it. The person watching the lady eat cake is enjoying the experience in all sorts of weird, creepy ways. We can discuss and go down a feminist route, or at least we could if we had the time and the inclination to go down a feminist sociological route. Is this a form of control? Is the man abusing, exploiting the woman? I mean, clearly, if she didn't want to keep eating chips, she'd have stopped a long time ago, so we assume she's getting some satisfaction out of it. But then, is it a form of mental illness on her part, this compulsive overeating? Is the man exploiting the woman's compulsive overeating? And it's not just men and women, it's women feeding men, so it's the man who's the big one and the woman who is the feeder. And I'm sure there must be same-sex couples where feeding is a phenomenon. So whatever the gender relationship is this a form of abuse? Is it taking advantage of somebody else's mental ill health to get your jollies off watching them do something they really should have stopped doing a long time ago, because they'll end up with diabetes and heart disease and liver disease and Lord knows how many other diseases? Different cultures have different standards of beauty. Certainly there are cultures in which quite big women are considered sexually desirable, or quite big men. Not necessarily as big as the lady in the photograph, but biggish. So not every culture idolises the size 0 supermodel. At what point does it become abusive? And does abuse become an issue where two people appear to be voluntarily engaging in activity, whether that's one person shoving chips in the face of another, or one person whipping another, or again, could that be classed as a form of mental illness? If somebody enjoys being beaten half senseless until the blood is running, is that a form of mental illness? Or is it just sexual jollies, and therefore an act of free will? And if somebody wants to engage in it, well, who is anyone else to criticise? How do we contextualise and understand these patterns of behaviour? The couple in the photograph at the bottom are, I believe, no longer actually a couple. This was on, there was a documentary that was followed up by the two of them appearing in at least a couple of early morning news programmes. The one in the dog suit is a man, and the woman sitting next to him used to be his girlfriend until it all got a bit too much, and I think it was she who ended the relationship. But they were still appearing together in the documentary because apparently they're still friends, or at least they were at the time of the documentary, even though they're no longer boyfriend-girlfriend. Now, the man in the dog outfit, the Dalmatian outfit, I'm not sure what that's made out of, if it's leather or rubber or what it is, but I don't suppose it matters. There is this whole subculture of mostly men, apparently, who like dressing up in dog outfits. And some of them are fairly clearly sadomasochistic outfits made out of leather. How can we put it? Not terribly convincing as dog costume. This one that this guy is wearing, it's pretty all-encompassing, and it's, I should imagine, probably cost him an absolute fortune. He enjoys dressing as a dog. Now, in the documentary, he was a theatre worker backstage. He did lighting or something backstage of a theatre, and he goes to work in his usual jeans and t-shirt type thing. But when he comes home of an evening, he likes to put on his dog costume, his dog outfit, and likes doing dog type things. I dare say you can look for this documentary. It's up on YouTube, I believe, if you really want to watch it. There was a scene in which he had a friend, a male friend, so I don't know whether he's bisexual or what he is. I'm not sure. But the male friend was taking him for walkies in the park in his dog outfit whilst the cameras were rolling. Now, I don't know if they normally do that when the cameras aren't rolling, or if this was just some kind of stunt they put on for the cameras. Clearly, it would get a little bit odd if it left the privacy of the bedroom and became a thing people engaged in the park, but that's another issue again, and we're getting into the realm of public and private, and Jürgen Habermas's sociological theories on that one. Whatever satisfaction this chap gains from wearing his dog outfit, and we could speculate, again, is this a mental health issue? When he was being interviewed in the documentary, he did seem a little fragile, if we can put it like that. A very sweet man, very shy. I suspect he had a variety of issues, but we'll put all of that to one side. He gains satisfaction. He says it's not wholly a sexual thing, it's more of a kind of an emotional sense of contentment when he's in his dog suit. He feels happier in himself. Supposing he were going to a sex worker and paying her money to take him for walkies, or him for walkies, whichever sex worker prefers, male or female, and put food in a bowl and pat him on the head and say, "Oh, who's a good boy then," or whatever it is that he once said to him, but without any sex. So his zip stays up, and he just kind of gets treated as a dog for half an hour or however long. Is that sex work? There's no actual sex taking place. He may or may not be enjoying the experience in an erotic way, but he may well also be enjoying the experience in a more sort of emotional, comforting way, rather than necessarily a purely erotic thing. And he's offering, let's say, to pay somebody 60 quid an hour or whatever to treat him like a dog. Is it sex work? There are people who like dressing up as babies and hiring others to, well, let's not get too graphic about what goes on, but you can imagine, to treat them like babies in various different capacities for a period of time, whilst they're wearing nappies and bonnets and holding giant-sized baby bottles and all that kind of palaver. Some of them, it's a sexual thing and they do get excited, and others it seems to be more of a sort of an emotional security thing. They just enjoy it without necessarily them getting sexually aroused in the experience. And this is women as well as men, I ought to point out. This is not just strange middle-aged men in baby outfits, it's strange middle-aged women in baby outfits too. Is it sex work? I'm not sure what the answer to that is. It would be interesting to hear your points of view, bounce those ideas around. At one level, I suppose, again, you could say, does it matter? But when it comes to issues such as the law, personal morality, where we distinguish between someone who has deep psychiatric issues where they need therapy rather than indulgence, and so therefore it's possible we might consider some forms of fetish to be actually harmful. And I don't just mean someone getting a few bruises by being slapped around with a wet haddock, but psychologically damaging in it could worsen their mental health problems rather than improve them. So we're thinking more psychological problems than physical harm necessarily. There's various contexts in which we need to understand what's going on for the purpose of understanding where it fits into society and society's laws and rules and regulations, but also in terms of things like health issues, mental health issues particularly. What's a problem and what's just a kink? How do we understand this? I do like the look on the woman's face. She looks utterly bewildered, as well she might. Speaking of the law, in England and Wales and Scotland, exchanging sexual services for money with somebody over the age of 18 is legal. Under the age of 18, clearly a crime, it's child abuse. But there are weird rules and regulations about the how and the where and the why of it. So soliciting in a public place. So that could be a curb crawler driving along, which is mentioned there as well. Driving along, soliciting, curb crawling is specifically in a car, so soliciting is if you're doing it on foot rather than in a car. But somebody wanders along, goes up to some lady, or possibly a man, but let's assume a lady for the moment, and goes, "Hello darling, how much for a good time?" That's soliciting. And you can see there anything up to £1,000 fine or a behavioural order. Likewise, a sex worker hanging around on a street corner going up to random strangers and going, "Fancy a good time, love? Only a tenner," is soliciting. Brothel work, which is where it's not on the street corner but in either someone's home or in hired premises, is in a different legal category. Now, a person in their own home, whether it's owned or rented, who exchanges sexual services or any of these other slightly more peculiar services for money to somebody coming directly to their house is not engaging in a crime. However, if there is a second person there, a second sex worker, who is therefore an employee of the first one, that counts as owning or managing a brothel. So in other words, you're not only selling yourself necessarily, but you're also gaining an income from somebody else, because you are getting a cut of the money that the other sex worker is earning. And it can sometimes be argued, even if the other sex worker doesn't give you a cut of the money, they just use your spare bedroom, nonetheless it's taking place in your premises, therefore it is assumed in law that some kind of exchange is taking place. So owning or managing a brothel, up to 7 years in prison. Pimping, pandering, which is to be a go-between. So pandering is a rather old-fashioned term for pimping, where you'd say, well, I've got 3 women in this building and you can have sex with any of them for 30 quid. You take so the pimp takes the money and the customer goes into the building and has sex with one of the women or one of the men or what have you. That's pimping, that's pandering, and that too faces a stiff prison sentence. Other countries have, some countries have much stricter laws against prostitution. Other countries have much more relaxed laws against prostitution. It'd be interesting to find out what you think about the British laws, whether you think they're too strong or too weak or just right. That whole Goldilocks thing going on there. But clearly the law is not happy with the notion of sex work. It sees it as an issue that needs strongly regulating and dealing with. The ladies I mentioned earlier, Cynthia Payne and Miss Whiplash, the ones who had the sadomasochistic brothels a few decades ago, they were eventually convicted under tax evasion offences, that they'd been earning all sorts of money from running their services and not paying tax upon it, which is, in other words, I suppose if the law can't get you one way, it will get you another, which is reflective of the discomfort of the establishment with allowing this type of work to take place, even if sometimes there are members of the establishment as customers of such services. Said earlier that statistics are very hard to find on a global scale, but there are smaller scale research projects, more localised research projects that have put out statistics as to patterns of prostitution. So this one from 2015, which was a UK-based survey, as you can see there, they surveyed a large number of people, 72,800 regular sex workers. I'm not wholly sure off the top of my head how regular constitutes regular, how often constitutes regular in the case of this. So once a week, once a month, once a year. I'm not too sure on that front. But as you can see from the statistics there, 88% of the sex workers were women, 6% men, 4% transgender, and the remaining 2% unknown. So comparatively few men, 6%, but we're still talking over 4,000 men on the game in this particular survey, and over 64,000 women on the game. That was 2015, 5 years on. It may have gone up, it may have gone down, it may be roughly the same. Assuming, of course, that this was a convincingly reliable survey of the whole country. I suspect a lot of people would not answer. If they heard there was somebody who is a sex worker who heard there was a survey taking place, might well opt not to get involved for fear of prosecution or being identified in some way, and so might remain very cagey. So there could well be much more than 72,800 people as regular sex workers. And as Brooks Gordon and the rest indicated, That was just regular sex work, people for whom this was a fairly consistent form of income. There are other people out there who might engage in sex work once, twice, 3 times in their life, when they're kind of desperate for money, and so they've got a major bill to pay, no other way of getting the cash, that sort of thing. So they might engage in sex work there. I don't know why that box has come up. Never mind. Moving on, institutional issues. So functionists, or various shapes and forms, people like Durkheim and so on, argue that if a system in society persists over a period of time, it must be because that system serves a function, a useful function, or at least it's assumed to serve a useful function. There are critics of this, like Merton, who suggested actually some institutions in society can go on and on and on long after they've stopped providing any useful function for anyone. But the argument here might be, well, prostitution has existed since, well, Lord knows how long, thousands and thousands of years. It's existed a hell of a long time, and it crops up in many, 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 many societies all around the world. Does this therefore mean that prostitution must serve a function? Even in societies that try to outlaw it, it persists. Therefore, is it functional? Is it useful? And useful in this context can be understood in a couple of different ways. It could be useful to the individual who needs money. It could be useful to the person who wants to have sex but can't find anyone to have sex with them willingly. It might be useful for people who could find someone who wants to have sex with them willingly, but for other reasons, which we can contemplate later, prefers to pay for it. It could be useful to wider society. Does it deal with economic problems without the government having to get involved in improving the benefit system, for example, to people in straitened circumstances? Does it help support, as some people have argued, does it support institutions like marriage by giving an outlet to the husband, possibly to the wife as well, which then they then go back to the marriage rather than ending the marriage? They remain within it because the prostitute service locally gives them an outlet so that they don't then want to end their marriage. There's a variety of ways in which we could potentially understand how it might serve a function. Now, functionists are not saying the function automatically de facto means this is a good thing, because the function could be a rather dark, destructive function. So it's not all, just because it's functional doesn't mean it is necessary, or that same function couldn't be met in a much better, much more constructive, much more pro-social way. So this is not functionists approving prostitution, this is just functionists looking at what the pragmatic benefits of prostitution might be. Other people have suggested that stereotypes need challenging, they need questioning. So another 2015 study, this time University of Leeds, discovered that the assumed stereotype of a sex worker, which could be a very uneducated woman, not with a sufficient range of skills that she could make money by more legitimate means, but who turns to sex work out of desperation because there's nothing else going for her, whether to pay the rent or meet a drug addiction or whatever else. That very negative stereotype is not necessarily accurate and reliable. So this 2015 study, for example, found that 38% of the sex workers they spoke to, and that's quite a big chunk, had a degree, a bachelor's degree, and some of them had master's degrees as well. Some of them indeed were using sex work as a means of paying off their student loans, which I am not suggesting for a minute you consider, but it does happen. Others were perfectly well equipped with skills and knowledge and educational accomplishments, where they could earn money by perfectly legal, legitimate means, but had chosen to engage in sex work as making more money or making it more rapidly, all sorts of kind of economic, practical reasons where they had opted for sex work, desperation for cash not being one of them. So this is not to say that there aren't any women who turn to prostitution out of sheer desperation, or indeed men who turn to prostitution out of sheer desperation for money, but that there are quite a chunk of people who do it for other reasons. These 70% you've got noted there at the bottom of the screen worked, so indoors, rather, in other words brothels, they were working from home, their own home or a brothel, rather than hanging around on street corners trying to pick up passing trade. Which again, when you're thinking films and TV shows that include prostitution, often it is that sort of very rough people on street corners who look as if they've got drug habits or do indeed have drug habits, and a whole raft of social problems being beaten up by their pimps, and it's all sort of like a hangover from 1970s cop shows, whereas these research projects are suggesting the reality of sex work is somewhat different from the negative TV stereotype of sex work. And brothels are much more common than previously believed. Now, the MGTOW and WGTOW thing we mentioned last week, and indeed you might recognise that poster from last week. So in case you've forgotten, MGTOW is men going their own way, and WGTOW, women going their own way. So last week we mentioned that some of the men who opt not to have relationships with women, or indeed women who opt not to have relationships with men, take what is referred to as the monk path or the nun path. That is to say, they just become celibate. They don't have sex with anyone at all ever, and that's their life for as long as they choose to be on that path, and they have the whole ideology to support them in turning away from relationships with the other sex. But not all people go down that route. Some people in MGTOW and WGTOW movements, which are mainly social media phenomena these days, they don't want a relationship, let's say. They don't want a girlfriend or a boyfriend. They don't want to be holding hands and being all lovey-dovey and the rest of it, but they still want sex. So one option that they consider, rather than just going for one-night stands with strangers, there are some men in the MGTOW movement, possibly some women in the WGTOW movement too, who say, or go and hire someone, go and hire a sex worker for a night or an hour or 10 minutes or whatever long it takes, and meet their physical needs, if we can put it in such a way, with the transaction of money up front. No emotional involvement. The prostitute gets the money, the customer gets relief, if we can put it like that. Everyone is theoretically happy and no one is being misled, where the argument being that if you go for a one-night stand, the person you are having a relationship with might imagine that you feel more for them than you do, and they might therefore feel hurt and rejected when you don't phone them the next day, and therefore the sex work option is more upfront, more honest. Various arguments around that are made. Is it a fair point? We live in this swipe left, or have I got that wrong and it's swipe right? I think it's swipe left culture, where you've got all of these various dating apps and websites and such like, where people, men and women alike, who just want a quick leg over, go onto one of these apps, they look at 101 photographs, swipe through them until they find the one they think, yeah, you'll do, and meet up with them, they have sex, they go away again, they probably never see that person again, they might not even bother asking their name. That's a phenomenon of modern life. No money need change hands. Is that better or worse than prostitution? Is that they're both forms of casual sex with zero emotional commitment. They're both behaviours that effectively treat sex as a physical release, as a an itch that needs scratching, as it were, rather than as an emotional bonding, affectionate endeavour? Is the swipe culture better or worse than what the MGTOW, WGTOW people are arguing here of just be upfront, hire someone, no one is misled? What's the dynamics involved here? Again, something to you to think about. If you want to pause it, have a coffee, think about it, start the video again later. Discuss it with other people. Discuss it with whoever's in your house if you're able to, or discuss it socially online. What's your view on this? If we get into the realm of feminist ideology, we get a mixed array of views, strongly diametrically opposed array of views. Newman and White wrote their 2012 book, summarised that there were two main and one smaller point of view. The sex work perspective that saw sex work as a positive thing, as a free choice of the women involved, and it being feminism, the focus is on female sex workers rather than male sex workers, by and large. Effectively seeing it as a potentially positive thing. The abolitionist perspective is dead against it and regards sex work as a form of slavery, a form of exploitation and abuse that countries must seek to stamp out, whereas the sex work view is that countries should see this as just another form of work and therefore introduce the sorts of rules and laws that would affect any kind of work, health and safety type stuff, tax rules and regulations, methods to ensure that the sex workers are not at risk of violence or disease, all of that sort of thing. The third, less popular perspective, the outlaw perspective, acknowledges that sex work is very sort of shadowy, very out on the edges of the law, the outskirts of the law. However, it tends to focus on the fact that for a lot of people who do it, it's not a lifelong career. It's something they do to earn a bit of money, to get themselves into a better financial position, and then they move from the sex work into a regular job sort of thing. So it's rather than it being a lifelong thing, it's a temporary sort of situation which needs to be understood in that light. We'll mainly look at the first two perspectives. So the sex work perspective is something that is occasionally referred to as the Nordic model, because Sweden and Norway and related countries have, some in the late 90s and others in the around 2009, changed their law around this issue in the light of feminist views and other views held by their politicians and by campaign groups and so forth, to decriminalise sex work for the person doing it, the sex worker or prostitute, whatever word you want to use, and to shift the focus onto the person buying it, the customer. So their argument is it's not the sex worker who should be seen as wicked and sinful, which is certainly the kind of view you could have heard in the Victorian era or the Edwardian era, that these were fallen women, wicked, dirty ladies. It's not that sort of an attitude that they want to see in the Scandinavian countries, but rather one in which the moral onus is placed upon the customer, the person purchasing sex, which most of the time is probably going to be a man, occasionally a woman, but mostly a man. And so they've altered their laws accordingly so that the law falls against the customer rather than the provider, which in many ways is a little bit odd. Certainly if you think of drug laws over here, it's both the dealer and the consumer who face the weight of the law with regards to cocaine or heroin, crack, that sort of thing. We have an oddity when it comes to steroids, in that anabolic steroid usage is not a crime. However, the retail, the dealing of anabolic steroids is. So there are laws in which sometimes it's both the customer and the retailer who are criminalised, and sometimes it's only the customer and sometimes it's only the retailer, which is curious variations on legal themes, and which one you think is better. whether it comes to drugs or sex work or anything else, would be an interesting thing to discuss. The argument made under the Nordic model, and this is something that has been discussed in this country but obviously not implemented, is that yes, the sex worker and the customer are consenting, at least to a point. On the case, there are disputes when it comes to the sex worker, but to a point there is consent going on. But they regard this relationship as fundamentally abusive and exploitative, and therefore the customer is the one doing the abusing, the one doing the exploiting. And they regard it as on a par with a relationship in which no money changes hands, but there is still nonetheless abuse and exploitation by one person of another person, whether through violence or intimidation or whatever other means might be used. Not everyone on the sex-positive side goes down this line. Some of them argue that prostitution should be decriminalised entirely, both for the customer and the sex worker, and that society should just get on board, tax it, regulate it for issues such as sexually transmitted diseases, which is largely what happens in the Netherlands, where there are requirements for sex workers to have regular testing for STDs to try and stop the spread of STDs, and see it as a job rather than as something shameful. And indeed, some of the people arguing in favour, from a feminist point of view, of the sex worker positivity approach, suggest that it's even more than safety and regulation and so on. More than that sex work can be empowering for the women who do it. That they are taking charge of their own sexuality, their own appetites, their own bodies, and that in a better society, no one would be bullied or intimidated or pressured into sex work. Rather, they'd do it through their own choice, and therefore they'd retain the power to say no to a given customer they didn't want to go with. So they'd only be having sex with customers they did want to have sex with, and not with people they found revolting or unpleasant or threatening in some way. That the empowerment of decriminalising would give sex workers the sorts of rights that, say, a shop worker could have if a customer's being very rude to you or very aggressive to you. You can refuse to serve them. Then the argument is that sex work and shop work on that kind of a basis would have certain similarities. That the empowered sex worker could say no, just as the empowered shop worker can say, get out of my shop. Be interesting to see what you are thinking along those lines. The abolitionist approach, people like Julie Bindel, Catherine McKinnon and loads of others, have argued that all forms of sex work are abusive and exploitative. Their main interest is in cases where it's the woman being the sex worker rather than the man is a sex worker. But the same argument would apply across to where it's a man selling his services either to women or to other men. It's abuse. They argue the women are always pressured into it through economic desperation, poverty, drug addiction, sex trafficking, where they're threatened with violence by trafficking gangs, that sort of thing. And therefore it becomes a form of control and abuse. So when the woman is either on a street corner or in a brothel, whichever situation, she might appear to be consenting to go with a customer, but she doesn't truly have the freedom to say no. Therefore the customer, even if they don't threaten the sex worker, they're sort of very polite and friendly and what's it, they are nonetheless exploiting, abusing that sex worker, even if they don't automatically realise that that's what they're doing. So they have a very different stance, very different take on the issue of prostitution. The quote from McKinnon there is, prostitution is a free choice, while the women with the fewest choices, the ones most often found doing it. That clearly would be challenged by that previous piece of 2015 research about the 38% of women with undergraduate degrees who could therefore go and get well-paid jobs. However, there is this widespread perception, and perhaps also we need to factor in the global issue, that obviously that 2015 piece of research was in the UK. If we were to look at prostitution in the third world, for argument's sake, are we going to find lots of women with degrees and bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, what have you, who choose to become prostitutes, or are we predominantly going to be looking at desperately poor women who are struggling to survive, put food on their table, keep a roof over their head, and therefore end up doing sex work full-time, part-time, whatever, because they really, really, really need the money, because they don't have the full range of economic choice. That is difficult to say one way or the other, to argue for definite one way or the other, because I said right at the start, we don't have reliable international figures. We only have small-scale research projects on this sort of thing. Is the gigolo, or the rent boy, also being exploited by richer men, or in the case of the gigolo, richer women? Is that also a form of sexual violence, which McKinnon and Bindel argue very strongly? This is not run-of-the-mill abuse. This is tantamount, certainly as far as McKinnon is concerned, tantamount to rape. But rape, rather than using violence, using economic incentives, or the implicit threat of poverty. I suppose if you don't have sex with me, I won't give you any money, therefore you won't pay the rent, that kind of thing. Coming back to issues of evidence, there's another study here, this time a 2011 study with the London Metropolitan University. They spoke to a large number of sex workers and found that 6% of them felt pressured into it. The other 94% did not feel pressured into it, which really doesn't support the argument made by Bindel or McKinnon in terms of the scale of prostitution, although their argument would apply to that 6% quite clearly, which could still be a very large number of women on the whole, and indeed a large number of some men. The others said that they were doing it through choice. Now, I suppose this kind of depends on the circumstances under which the 2011 study was conducted, and the interviews, how private they were, how free the women interviewed felt able to answer the questions, or were they worried that someone would find out and assault them if they'd given the wrong answer, that sort of thing. It's lots of discussions and debates there. Nikki Adams is or was a member of the English Collective of Prostitutes, which is sort of like a trade union kind of thing for prostitutes that seeks to get law reforms in favour of sex workers being able to do their jobs more safely, and they do regard them as jobs rather than as some horrible negative thing they're pressured into. So Nikki Adams is very much of the first point of view, the sex worker point of view, rather than the abolitionist point of view. She'd go along with that argument there that prostitutes, sex workers, call them what you are, exerting their own agency, their own choice. An argument, or at least a paraphrase of an argument made by Nikki Adams and other people who have a similar outlook, is that if you were given the option, you can either clean toilets for £8 an hour, or you can engage in another activity for £100 an hour. Which would you sooner do? Now, I'd assume the vast majority of people would probably say they'd quite like to do the £100 an hour job. Well, what if that £100 an hour job involved taking your clothes off? Now, let's say you were a nude model for an art class. Would you do that for £100 an hour? Some people would possibly be way too embarrassed, or it would be against their religion or something of that sort. Other people might well say, "Way, hey, £100 an hour just to sit there with my kit off, I'd go and do that." Well, what if there is some degree of touching involved? And so we kind of go into these arguments. And so Adams's perspective is that for a lot of people, even if there is quite a lot of touching involved, i.e. sex work in the usual sense of having sex with strangers, or even in the more curious examples we've mentioned earlier, like dancing in front of a camera, or that guy cleaning his teeth, and the one dressed as a Dalmatian. Some more weird thing which could be loosely constituted as sex work. If somebody said, I'll pay £100 an hour to watch you clean your teeth, or I'll pay £100 an hour if I can put on a dog outfit and you take me for walkies, pat me on the head and tell me that I've been a good boy, would you take the £100 an hour? Now, some people undoubtedly would say absolutely not. Other people would be signing up on the spot. And it's not necessarily the people signing up on the spot are not necessarily desperately poor. They're not necessarily incapable of making £8 an hour cleaning toilets or £10 an hour stacking shelves in a supermarket. It's just they have made a rational decision that rather than earning a low amount of money, they'd sooner earn a really high amount of money, and they don't mind doing what's involved to earn the high amounts of money. And likewise, Adams and similar people make the argument that we're all more or less selling ourselves. We're all agreeing that I will do such and such an activity for such and such an amount of money per hour. And that activity could be teaching a class sociology, it could be cooking food in a restaurant, it could be bandaging patients in a hospital, it could be pushing a broom around the streets, it could be standing up in court and acting as a barrister, it could be 101 different things. But we're all saying, yes, I will do so-and-so activity, but only if you pay me a certain amount. And some people would include sex as one of the activities that they are prepared to do, if the money is right. So this is one of these cases where you get very, very different opinions. And the opinions are very strongly held, if I can put it like that, not to say very vociferously held, in that there's often been real ding-dong slamming matches between people on the abolitionist side and people on the sex worker side. It's one of those subjects that gets people really, really hot under the collar in both directions. And you might want to look at some of the arguments. There's debates uploaded on YouTube and in books and all sorts of places. So if you read around these debates, you're going to see some very forceful opinions. Are there other ways? Are there other alternatives? Now, if you're thinking the women in the photograph look a bit weird, they do, because they're not actually women at all. If you have a good look at the photo, they're dollies, rubber dollies. Well, I say rubber, I'm not actually sure what they're made out of, but they're not real people. That's the key thing. They are sex dolls. Now, there's been sex dolls for quite a while. There's those awful, silly rubber things that get inflated during stag parties and hen parties at one end of the market, and some super expensive things. There are, you can look at documentaries about this, Channel 5 documentaries. Some of them are what are supposedly meant to be very realistic sex dolls, and including ones with microchips and things implanted in them so that they will speak certain phrases. There are people in various countries, Japan for example, who are looking at developing ones that can move. They don't just lay there, that they will be able to engage in a limited amount of movement with robotics within the doll. The levels of science that go into this are surprisingly high, but I suspect they're only surprisingly high because the people doing the research think they're going to make an absolute fortune selling them. And they might. I mean, they might be wrong, they might all go bankrupt, but they may well be right that they will make a ton of money selling these sex dolls. And obviously the ones in the photo there are female-shaped sex dolls, but you can also buy male-shaped sex dolls, and if you really, really, really want to creep yourself out, and I certainly don't recommend you Googling this one because you'll end up on a government list somewhere, there is a company in Japan that makes child-shaped sex dolls. The guy who runs the company is himself a convicted sex offender, a convicted paedophile, and his argument is that if he is selling these dolly things, life-size dolls, to sex offenders, to paedophiles, then at least they're molesting a lump of plastic. They're not molesting a real child. Now, I believe it's, from what I understand of Japanese law, perfectly legal over there. It is completely illegal in this country. And indeed, there is a local instance of this because there was a man arrested in Felixstowe sometime last year because he had tried to import by mail order over the internet, I'd assume, one of these child-shaped dolls, and it was coming through customs, and I guess a custom officer opened the box and thought, what the hell is this? And they tracked down the man who'd ordered it. He was a paedophile, and he was arrested for importing this doll because it's a criminal activity over here. You might agree with that, I certainly do, or you might be persuaded that, as per the Japanese businessman's argument, that at least whilst someone is amusing themselves with a lump of plastic, they're leaving real children alone. And that is a kind of a key critical argument, not child specifically, because it extends to these adult-shaped dolls, between people like Kathleen Richardson and David Levy. Richardson's argument, and she's not talking about the paedophile issue, she's just talking about the dolls in general, she says are demeaning to women. It's treating a lump of plastic or silicon or whatever the hell these things are made out of, treating one of them as if it were a real woman, and by extension a real woman as if she were a lump of plastic. And therefore she says Richardson is against prostitution anyway, and so Levy's argument is that if some guy has issues, or indeed some woman has issues, and wants to indulge their tastes with a robot, that is preferable to them indulging their tastes with a real human being who would be exploited and hurt and put upon and all the rest of it. So he sees this as a preferable alternative to abusing real people. Whereas Richardson's argument is that even though there's no real people involved, the attitudes of the person buying this doll and using this doll their attitudes towards real humans will degenerate and get worse. And therefore it's kind of possibly, whilst it may be a solution in the short term, in the long term it doesn't do anyone any good. And so what this person needs to do is maybe get therapy or something like that to try and work out why they have problems with real women, or indeed in the case of these weirdos who buy the child sex dolls, why they have paedophile tendencies, to address that rather than just keep indulging the problem by buying a dolly. Now, some of these dolls are very, very, very expensive, as I said, and so not everyone can afford to buy one. So there are now brothels in which the customer goes along, and obviously a human runs the place, but once you've got through the door and paid your money to the human being, the customer is then shown into a room with a doll, and they can do whatever it is that they wish to do. You draw a veil over that one with the doll, which let's hope is cleaned between customers. The doll is meant to be as lifelike as current levels of technology can make it. Could this be a future? So rather than, let's say, the red light district in Amsterdam being lots and lots of rooms with women and the occasional man stood in a window charging people however many euros an hour for a jolly, could the future be rooms with robots in them? And either you hire the robot for an hour, or if you're rich enough, you buy the thing outright and take it home and keep it. There is a documentary, I think it was either Channel 4 or Channel 5, in which they interviewed a group of men, most of them were American, there were a couple of British ones as well, who had purchased their own doll. There was one guy who had actually not purchased one doll, he'd got about half a dozen of them. And in one scene in the documentary, he'd sat them all around the dining table and dressed them, not in the kind of lingerie like the ones in the photos are dressed, but in sort of Laura Ashley frocks, that kind of thing. And he'd named each one, and he spoke to them. Now, they didn't have the voice implant chip where they could talk back to him, so I guess he must have just imagined the voices in his head or something like that. But he was treating these dolls not as a lump of plastic, he was treating them as if they were real women. Freud would have a field day. Is this just a lonely man with a disposable income who is finding some level of happiness and not annoying any real women, and therefore an acceptable expression of his needs? Or should society be outlawing this sort of thing? Should society be trying to address why that guy is not able to sustain relationships with flesh and blood women? Should he be addressing, I say society addresses it, and it's not like the social workers are going to go around and force therapy on them, but is this an issue where he needs to book himself into therapy instead of spending a couple of $1,000s on a bunch of rubber dollies and try to work out why he has problems? Does society have a responsibility to help him work out why he has issues, why he feels the need for these figurines in his life rather than an actual human being? What if it's a woman buying male sex dolls, or a gay man buying male sex dolls, or a lesbian buying female sex dolls? Does that shift the dynamic in any way, change our understanding of the situation in any way? Or is this just the same situation, slightly different gender dynamic, but same situation? How do we comprehend these things? Something for you to debate and discuss. A quote there from Kathleen Richardson: "Only the buyer is recognised as a subject. The seller of sex, and by virtue the sex robot, is merely a thing to have sex with." This is a sort of a, shall we say, the crux of Richardson's argument here, is that the robot obviously is a thing. It's a lump of plastic, silicon, microchips, whatever else. It's not a person, it's a thing. If you get used to, if a person gets used to having sex with a thing, will they start to imagine and treat real human beings whom they might have had sex with in the past or might at some point in the future have sex with? Will they start to treat them as things as well? And as per Richardson's underlying argument here, is where the sex worker is actually a human being, not a robot, is the sex worker also treated as a thing, not as a person? So the customer says, "Oh, do you like doing it this way?" And the sex worker, if they want to earn their money, will say yes, even if they don't, and pretend to like things they're not liking. If the customer says, "Oh, will you wear this particular article of clothing?" the sex worker usually will say yes, because it's money, even if they wouldn't be seen dead in that article of clothing under any other circumstance. So, in other words, are we treating that person as the customer, are they treating that person as a thing, not as a person? So this is going back to the whole object-subject dynamic between the subject, who is a person, and the object, who is not a person, who is just a thing. It opens up a bit of a can of worms on that one, because we could also, and certainly members of the English Sex Workers Collective, English Collective of Prostitutes, and similar organisations in other countries have argued, isn't that also true of just about every other line of work? So, for example, as a teacher, let's say you've got a history teacher, for the sake of argument, the headmaster, headmistress will say, "Well, this is the syllabus, you need to go and teach your class about the Tudors. That's what's on the syllabus, that's what you have to teach." They're not saying to that teacher, "You're a person, do you like the Tudors? Do you enjoy teaching the Tudors?" Because frankly, even if the teacher doesn't like teaching the Tudors, they are paid to teach the Tudors. So they've got to do it whether they like it or not. It's not their choice, just is the money, get on with it. Likewise, let's say they've got 30 odd pupils in their class. Some of them they will like, some of them they will be totally indifferent to. and some of them they will possibly want to shove under a bus. Again, the teacher isn't asked, do you want to teach this child, this pupil? The teacher is told, you are paid to stand in front of this class and teach them, whether you think they're lovely, whether you are totally indifferent to them, or whether you can't stand them. Your personal feelings are neither here nor there. You are paid the money, you turn off your personal feelings, you put on your happy smiley mask and pretend you enjoy the tutors, even if secretly you're bored to death by the tutors. You get on with it, you teach it, you do it. Therefore, is the teacher in that case an object? They are a thing that delivers a lesson, not a person. The same applies to shop workers, to hospital workers, to factory workers, to any shape, size of work you care to imagine. You're paid to deliver a service whether you like it or not, and you have often very little control over the nature of what you're paid to deliver. You just take the money and get on with it. So does the act of taking the money make you an object? Now, you could get all Marxists and say, oh, this is the capitalist system. But is it any different in Russia or Cuba or China? People get paid a wage, they deliver a service. It's not any different under communism than it is under capitalism. If you take the money, you deliver the service whether you want to or not, whether you enjoy it on that particular day or you don't enjoy it on that particular day. That's just the way of things. So is it any different for a sex worker than it is for any other type of worker, becomes a question. Richardson would argue, yes, it very much is different. Other people would say, well, no, it's pretty much of a muchness. It's not that different at all. We're kind of verging a little bit into transhumanism here, but only a little bit. Transhumanism is that movement to go beyond being a human being to include both robots, to start thinking of robots as human beings, but also to start uploading cybernetic technology into a human being. So you have implants and things, so you're not wholly human anymore, you're sort of, well, not quite a Cyberman, but sort of veering towards it a little bit. The quote you got there from Matt McMullen, who made the dolls in the photograph, he's not the only one, there are other people out there creating other types of dolls, but he's one of the people. This idea that there are a lot of people out there who, for one reason or another, have difficulty forming traditional relationships with other people. It's really all about giving those people some level of companionship or the illusion of companionship. And that, I think, is perhaps a key point, that last phrase there, illusion of companionship. Because like the guy in the documentary who dresses his dolls up and sits them around the table and calls them all by different names, that's gone beyond him just wanting to have sex with a doll. He's treating them as companions, as if they were people. And there are people who are lonely for all sorts of reasons. It could be that, a bit like those incels we mentioned the other week, that they are unattractive, they're socially awkward, they don't have many social graces, they find it difficult to make relationships. It could be that they have psychiatric issues that make forming a relationship pronouncedly difficult. Sometimes it could be a physical disability that becomes a barrier to having a relationship, or at least find it hard to meet anyone who's willing to meet them on the same, meet them as a fellow human being. I mean, in an ideal world, everyone would have a loving, close relationship, but we're not in an ideal world. We're in a world where there are a lot of lonely people around for all sorts of different reasons. So does this robotic outlet, is it a positive thing in that it might give the illusion of companionship to someone who'd otherwise be very lonely? Or is it a sign that if you need to date a robot, you are a bit of a failure? As a human being, you've not been able to form a warm and loving relationship with a normal human being. How do we contextualize it? A doll will do whatever you want the doll to do. It has no free will, it has no agency of its own. If you get used to treating this supposed companion as just a lump of plastic devoid of agency, is there, as Richardson implies, high probability that this will overlap into your everyday relationships, not just with your sexual relationships, work colleagues, next door neighbours, family, whatever, where you're so used to making the dolly do what you want it to do, you start assuming everyone else has to do what you want them to do as well. And you lose sight of their agency, their humanity. We've already touched on this child issue, so we won't return to that because it is rather rancid. But it questions where the law ought to draw the line as to what is an acceptable form of personal entertainment, if we can loosely describe it that way, and what is not. If we had a bit more time and my throat wasn't about to give way at any minute, we could also branch out from transhumanism with dollies to think about things like cybersex, where people are engaging in something that might be constituted as a sexual relationship with their avatar in cyberspace with somebody else's avatar in cyberspace. And does that count as sex? If their money changes hands, is that therefore prostitution? And how on earth do we contextualise relationships that take place in cyberspace rather than between two flesh and blood human beings present in the same room at the same time? But as my throat is about to give way, we'll move on. Back to McKinnon, who makes no bones about her view on this one. The money thus acts as a form of force, not as a measure of consent. It acts like physical force does in a rape. So it's comparing prostitution to rape. So that whilst the prostitute, the sex worker, hasn't been beaten up and dragged down a dark alley, nonetheless they are so desperate for the money that giving them the money forces them to consent to the requirements of the customer. Or does it? That's McKinnon's point of view. Do you agree with her? Do you disagree with her? Does it depend on whether the money is somebody with, let's say, a drug addiction or what have you, who really, really is desperate for money? But what about one of those people described earlier on who's got degrees, could earn a ton of money doing something legitimate, but quite likes the idea of large sums of money very quickly, and therefore would opt into sex work rather than doing a humdrum job that would take a lot longer to get the same amount of money? Is that therefore still on the same basis, or are we talking about two separate, two distinct phenomena here? Little bit about pornography, because we'll come back to this next week anyway. So just start to set the scene for next week. There isn't an absolutely clear-cut definition of where porn ends and art begins. So there's lots of statues in museums the world over of naked men and naked women, and some of the statues are naked couples being intimate with each other, let alone paintings and drawings and what have you. Is that art? Well, the museums say it's art, the galleries say it's art, or is it porn? Some people have viewed it as obscene. Obviously, you get some things overtly sold as pornography, in magazines and websites and what have you. There is this awkward definition as to where art and pornography part company, and it's not clear cut. So for Seltzer, it's subject matter. That could be a photograph, it could be a painting, a drawing, it could be a novel, or a racy novel, something like that, or a film. So that subject matter, whatever type of medium it's in, is for the exclusive purpose of sexual arousal. So if you go to the museum and you look at the ancient Greek statues of naked people, are you going there to get sexually excited by looking at those statues, or are you going there to admire the sculptor's gift at shaping a really convincing body and the curves of the muscles and the curl of the hair and the posing of the statues? Are you admiring art, or are you sitting there going, "Whoa," like someone in a Benny Hill sketch? Now, whilst there might be the odd one or two people who go to museums to get thrills from looking at statues, the majority, I assume, would be going there to admire it as art. So for Seltzer, that statue is art because you're looking at it for aesthetic reasons rather than because you want to get sexually excited. Whereas a porn magazine off the top shelf of a news agency, are you looking at that for artistic reasons, so you can admire the lighting and the camera angles and the flesh tones? Or are you looking at it because you want to get excited and go and privately amuse yourself? By and large, let's assume the majority of people who buy pornographic magazines probably do so because they want to amuse themselves rather than because they want to engage in some kind of artistic reflection on the quality of the photography. So that's Seltzer's working definition. Obviously, it wouldn't include the weird things we looked at earlier. So someone who wants to look at photographs of extremely overweight women or extremely overweight men who are just sitting on sofas eating cake, they might be getting profound sexual excitement from that. Does that therefore make it porn, even if they are fully clad ladies and men on the sofa and all they're doing is eating cake? They're not doing anything other than that. That's where it kind of gets weird and a bit grey. Because a lot of people would just look at that photograph and think, oh, it's an overweight person eating cake, and not think much more about it than that. Whereas certain people will look at it and become terribly excited by what they're looking at. So what is the kind of, in a sense, are we almost going for a majority view on this one? First law against pornography was passed in England and Wales back in 1857. Doesn't mean there was no such thing as porn before 1857. All sorts of explicit art and drawings and paintings and whatnot. But the law didn't touch on it as an issue until 1857 with the Obscene Publications Act, which tries to address this issue of how you distinguish between an obscene publication that included things like novels and photographs and artworks and so forth, and between something that is artistic. Not an easy, clear-cut distinction to make. Dawkins and Mackinnon are both, Dawkins similar opinions to Mackinnon, very much against prostitution, as we mentioned earlier, but also very much against pornography. And again, similar kinds of arguments that they see it as exploitation, as demeaning, and as a form of violence, or a photograph, or a drawing, or a film, whatever kind of medium it might be in, they categorise as violence. And this is an interesting issue in terms of quite what we define as violence. And this is the early days when more and more things, going back to the 70s, more and more things were starting to be classified as violence, at least by some people. So the usual definition of violence is a punch in the face, a kick up the backside, a physical act of violence. That word violence is then being extended to include verbal aggression, being extended to include a photograph, being extended to include a painting or a statue or a top shelf novel or a blue movie. So it's been extended to include a raft of things. Now their focus is again mainly upon the damage done to women. Now obviously an awful lot of porn is both men and women in the same video, and then you have gay porn where it's two men or two women in the video or in the photograph, whatever it might be. But their focus is not on the harm done to men in straight porn or men in gay porn, or indeed women in lesbian porn, but on women in porn aimed at heterosexual men. But also there are heterosexual women, of course, who enjoy looking at porn too. Is it a form of violence? Well, that's something we can get onto next week, but you might want to be thinking about it and discussing it in the meantime. Do you see it as just pictures, just film, or do you see it as a form of violence? Are Dawkins and Mackinnon's correct, or are they overreacting? What do you think? In this country, the law developed the Hickling test, going back to Victorian times, named after Benjamin Hickling, who was an official in the court. Henry Scott had been convicted in 1867 of distributing even explicit leaflets, dirty leaflets, which were saying rude, horrible things about Catholics. He was a very hardline Protestant, Henry Scott, and had been convicted as distributing obscene materials. Hicklin was the one who on appeal, in effect, I suppose, said that we cannot see those leaflets that Scott was distributing as obscene. They're not obscene. They may be offensive, but they're not obscene. So a test was then devised, and you've got that quote there. So is this video or this photograph or this book or whatever the thing may be, is it intended to deprave and corrupt those whose minds are open to such immoral influences? There's a quote very much in this same vein around Lady Chatterley's Lover, which D.H. Lawrence published in the early part of the 20th century. And the judge in the trial, which was the Obscene Publications Act, as should the book be banned and should D.H. Lawrence and his publisher face charges, the judge at one point rather notoriously said, "Would you want, gentlemen of the jury, would you want your servants to be reading this filth?" Bearing in mind, of course, Lady Chatterley's Lover is about the Lady Chatterley having it away with the gamekeeper, with one of the servants. Now, we could ask this notion of people whose minds are open to immoral influences. Well, are we talking children? There's a lot of worries about the impact of seeing pornography on children, which we'll touch on that next week, because obviously kids, being internet savvy, can go online and they can look at all manner of gruesome stuff within a matter of minutes, let alone getting naughty magazines from the top shelves of newsagents. What does it do to young minds if they see lots of explicit imagery? That's something we'll touch on next week. Will they be corrupted? But you've also, as per the Lady Chatterley's Lover example there, got concerns in different periods of history, different parts of the world, that maybe people of the lower social classes are more gullible, more easily depraved, more easily corrupted by things which gentlemen of the upper classes would not be corrupted by. Is that a valid point? I mean, these days that sounds very, very paternalistic, very patronising, but there are parts of the world which would still go along with those sorts of attitudes. Are they wrong? Are there concerns here that, because certainly for McKinnon and Dworkins, the worry is not only about the women appearing in the films or in the photographs, but also the impact on women in general, both women who might be watching them, but also if men go and watch these films, and then will they race out the house and do unspeakable things to women, abuse women or molest them or treat them like dirt because of what they have seen in a film or a magazine. So this kind of knock-on domino effect of pornography on the position of women. And you could well be arguing in terms of, we'll look at some of those arguments next week, from people of other points of view who've also said, well, what about the effect of men? You know, whether it's men in straight porn or men in gay porn, whatever. Is there an impact on them, negative or possibly even positive? How do we understand the impact on other people? So we'll get onto that in a bit more detail next week, and touch a bit on issues around sexuality and gender in education, but only a little bit. Now, if you can dig up the Film Educating Reader, obviously I can't lend you the video, the DVD, because we can't meet up anymore. So if you're able to find it on Netflix or on some other streaming service, or possibly have a look on YouTube, you might be able to find it there, or at least find clips of it, even if you can't find the whole thing. If you have a look at that, and then we can discuss some of that film next week. And as usual, if you've got questions, ideas, thoughts, whatnot that you want to explore, social media, email, Facebook, or append comments on the YouTube page underneath the video, and I'll get back to you. Okay, take care.